6 hours into the lockdown, Norvale Praxis's cleanroom floor had gone dead quiet in a way that 12 production lines never had been in the 2 decades I'd worked there when my phone finally rang. My name is Derek Ross. I'm 58. For 24 years, I've held the certified safety signature on this cleanroom's core interlock system, the one nobody else's name was ever attached to. $532,000. What remained on my wife's cancer treatment, self-funded past where our insurance carriers had already capped out, sat in an account only I checked. I hadn't said that balance aloud in this building. The caller was Tarun, and he didn't bother with a greeting. Every line downstream of the interlock had dropped into safe mode overnight. No alarms, no warning, just silence, and a chain of custody log that now showed a signature that wasn't mine attached to code Owen had spent 2 months calling obsolete. Derek, I need you to tell me this is fixable. I didn't answer right away. Outside my kitchen window, the desert heat hadn't broken yet, even at this hour, and I could hear the low hum of the swamp cooler working harder than it should have to. Chandler mornings in August always ran a few degrees past what the forecast promised, the air already carrying that faint scorched dust smell it got before the sun properly cleared the rooftops. How long has it been down? Since roughly 2, best we can tell. Nobody caught it until first shift badge scanned in, and the doors wouldn't clear. I already knew the answer before I asked the next question, the way you know a diagnosis before the second opinion confirms it. Did anyone touch the interlock logic without routing it through me first? Silence on the other end told me more than a yes would have. On the kitchen table in front of me sat the same folded printout I'd carried in my jacket pocket for most of 2 decades. The original interlock schematic, corners gone soft as cloth, ink faded in the creases from being opened and refolded more times than I'd ever bothered counting. I hadn't needed to look at it in years. I still knew where every line on it led. There's a client audit team landing Thursday, Tarun said. Full quals inspection. If this line's still dark when they walk the floor. I know what happens if it's still dark, I said. Can you get us back online before then? That depends on who signs the revalidation, and whose name is actually still on file to do it. He didn't have an answer for that either. I hadn't asked for this call. I want to be clear about that, because everything I did over the next 3 days will read, to anyone who wasn't the one holding that certification for 24 years, like a man who'd planned for exactly this moment. I hadn't. I'd simply never stopped being the only person whose signature the system was actually built to trust. Tarun asked 2 more questions. I gave him short answers to both, the kind that didn't commit me to anything yet, and told him I'd call back within the hour. 78 hours, best I could figure, before the window closed for good. 6 of them were already gone by the time anyone thought to call me, spent, as far as I could tell, arguing about whose name should go on the incident report instead of whose name had been on the certification the entire time. The bunny suit had gone damp at the collar by the time the tool load sequence stalled out on line 9, 14 days before Owen signed the order to strip the interlock code, 40 seconds left on a wafer batch that couldn't afford to sit unclamped. The shift supervisor wanted to force a manual override and push the batch through. I didn't need to pull up the logic diagram to know that was wrong. After 24 years, I could tell by the specific double-click stutter in the robotic arm's return stroke, the same sound I'd first learned to distrust back when this line was still being commissioned, that the interlock was reading a pressure differential the override would have punched straight through. Not a sensor glitch, a real one. The kind that ends with a cracked chamber and a line down for a week instead of an hour. Don't force it, I said. Pull the batch manually, arm by arm, and let the interlock finish its own fault sequence. That'll cost us the whole run. Forcing it will cost you the chamber. He didn't override it. I walked him through the manual pull myself, arm by arm, reading the pressure readout aloud each time so he could hear the number settle before we moved to the next one. The kind of work nobody photographs for a case study. Just 2 men in paper suits standing over a readout that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't spent years learning what a stable number actually looked like. The fault cleared itself once the differential equalized. Total cost, 1 delayed batch, recoverable by second shift. No cracked chamber, no week-long line down, no line item anyone above the floor would ever see. I logged it anyway, the way I logged everything. Not for credit, but because a fault that isn't written down is a fault someone eventually has to relearn the hard way, usually at a worse hour and a higher cost. The entry went into the same running record I'd kept since my first year here, cross-referenced against the interlock's original schematic, the one folded in my jacket pocket. Its crease is soft enough now that I barely needed to unfold it to know which line the fault traced back to. Leon caught me afterward near the gowning room. Badge already half-scanned. Line 9 again. Pressure differential. Handled. You logged it under your name or the department's? Mine. Always mine. Someday that's actually going to matter to somebody who isn't me, he said, not quite joking. It already matters to somebody, I said. The equipment. He didn't have much to say to that, so he just nodded and went to finish his own rounds, the kind of exchange that happened a dozen times a year and never once made it into any report anyone upstairs actually read. I drove home that evening past the citrus groves on the edge of town, windows down despite the heat, the schematic riding in my jacket pocket the way it always did, the fault log entry sitting quietly in the system next to 24 years of others nobody had ever once asked to review, filed under a name that had never once needed co-signing to mean something. Nobody at Norvale Praxis had any real sense yet that the same habit, reading the number instead of guessing at it, writing it down instead of letting it go, was the only thing standing between this clean room and a very different kind of Tuesday. Owen found me on the cleanroom mezzanine 7 days before he signed anything, the ship-fast keycap set on his laptop lid catching the overhead light as he set it down on the rail between us. I pulled the change history on the interlock module, he said. There's 41 lines nobody's touched since before I was hired, and about 6,000 more with zero inline documentation. That code's been stable for over a decade, I said. Stable doesn't always mean documented the way you're used to. Undocumented means unnecessary. He said it flatly, like a rule he'd learned once and never needed to test. If I can't read what it does, neither can whoever replaces you in 10 years. That's a liability sitting on our books. It's not sitting there doing nothing. It's holding the interlock's fault logic. Then we document it, clean it up, and rewrite what's actually load-bearing. 90% of legacy code like this is dead weight nobody's brave enough to delete. Have you had it reviewed by anyone certified on the safety side specifically? I've had it reviewed by 3 engineers who all agreed it reads like it was written to be unreadable on purpose. Nobody flagged a safety concern, Derek. They flagged a readability concern. Those aren't always separable in this kind of code. That's exactly the kind of thinking I'm trying to modernize out of this building. It wasn't written to be read casually, I said. It was written to be correct. Those aren't the same design goal. He smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't unkind so much as certain. I respect the tenure, Derek. I do. But I didn't get hired to preserve a museum piece. I got hired to modernize this floor. Modernizing and understanding aren't the same thing either. They will be, once it's rewritten. He picked the laptop back up, tapping the keycap once against his palm before tucking it under his arm. I'll loop you in when we schedule the cleanup sprint. Purely as a courtesy. I'd want to review any change to that module before it ships. Not after. Noted, he said, already turning to leave, in the tone people use when they've filed something under later and moved on. I didn't raise my voice watching him go. 24 years teaches you which fights get won in the room and which ones get won in the record, and this one was already going in the record, dated, time-stamped. The exhaust fans overhead cycling their low mechanical drone the way they had every day since before Owen had a driver's license. The faint smell of isopropyl still hanging in the gowning corridor behind him. This channel doesn't have many of these stories up yet, and if you're one of the few people watching this early, that means more than you'd think. I try to put up a new one most days, and I'd rather you kept hearing them here first. I've asked myself since whether I should have pushed harder in that moment. Insisted on a written commitment instead of a verbal courtesy, rather than letting him walk off with a laptop and a keycap and a smile that had already made up its mind. I've never landed on a clean answer. I only know which choice I made, and that I'd probably make it again, because arguing rarely changes a decision already made. Documentation sometimes does. The museum piece Owen wanted gone would turn out to be the only document in the building anyone actually needed. A printed change order was already sitting squared on the conference table when I walked in that Tuesday morning, 7 days after the mezzanine conversation, waiting in front of the one empty chair before I'd even sat down. I want to walk you through this before it goes to engineering, he said. We're moving forward with the interlock rewrite. Full scope, starting next sprint. Through the certified change control process. Through the standard engineering process. I looked into it. The certification retainer we've been paying on that module runs us $3.32 million a year. For code nobody can even read, that's not a defensible line item anymore. That retainer is what keeps the safety signature valid. It's not overhead. It's the thing that makes the interlock legally operable. Legally operable according to who? According to the standard your own compliance team already signed off on when this module went live. I've read the compliance file. It doesn't mention a required signature anywhere I could find. It's referenced by section number, not spelled out line by line. That's how these things are usually written. Then maybe it should be spelled out, and maybe that's a 5-minute conversation instead of a rewrite. Undocumented means unnecessary, Derek. I know you disagree. I respect that you disagree. He tapped the printed page once, the same flat gesture he'd used on the mezzanine rail. But this is happening. I wanted you to hear it from me directly instead of finding out from the sprint board. I slid the untouched change order an inch back across the table without picking it up, the paper cool and slightly tacky under my fingertips from the cleanroom's recycled air. I'd like that noted formally, that I was not consulted through the change control process before this was authorized. Noted. For the record, this isn't personal. It's a resourcing call. I understand it's a resourcing call, I said. I'm asking that my objection be resourced into the same record. It will be. I'll have someone forward you the ticket. Thank you. He stood, tucking the ship-fast laptop under his arm the way he always did when a conversation had reached its natural end for him. For what it's worth, once this is done, the module is going to be something anyone on the team can actually maintain. That's the whole point. I hope that's how it goes, I said, and meant it, in the narrow sense that I hoped nobody got hurt finding out otherwise. The ticket arrived that afternoon, 3 sentences long, authorizing the rewrite effective the following month. No mention anywhere in it of recertification, no mention of the signature the module's fault logic had been built around for over a decade. I read it twice at my desk, the overhead fluorescents humming their steady midday pitch, then forwarded a copy to my own personal account and closed the laptop without replying to the thread. That would have been bad enough on its own. A ticket and a rewrite and a retainer someone upstairs had decided was easier to cancel than to understand. But Norvale Praxis's single largest client, the one whose contracts alone accounted for nearly half the fab's annual output, had a full qualification audit of this exact line scheduled for late September, engineers flying in to walk the floor in person, and nobody in that conference room yet understood what they'd actually be walking into by the time they landed. The home office smelled faintly of the citrus trees outside the window by the time I finally sat down with the certification binder that evening, the one I hadn't opened in 3 years because I'd never needed to. To the auditors who'd filed it away, it was a compliance folder. To me, it was the only document in this story that actually mattered. The vendor's original safety instrumented system registration, my name printed on the signatory line as the fab's designated functional safety engineer, the one person whose validation the interlock's logic had been certified against since the day it went live. The rule was simple, and I read it twice to be sure I hadn't misremembered it after all these years. If the certified logic governing a safety instrumented function is modified without the designated engineer's revalidation, the embedded safety signature invalidates automatically, and the affected system reverts to a locked safe state until a newly designated engineer completes full recertification. No manual override, no executive exception, just a rule and a deadline, and a consequence that didn't care whose name was on the change order. Under the plant's own procedure, that recertification process, background review, physical inspection, documented sign-off from an accredited third party, ran a minimum of 4 to 6 weeks. Nobody was quietly reassigning that authority in an afternoon. Whoever eventually needed my signature again would need to actually ask for it. Buried 3 pages further into the binder sat a clause I'd forgotten was even there. The plant's supply agreement with its largest client carried a 78-hour disclosure window. Any safety instrumented system falling out of certified status had to be formally reported to that client within 78 hours, or the agreement's own audit terms allowed the client to treat the entire facility as non-compliant without further review. I photographed every page of the binder myself, laying each one flat under the kitchen light and squaring the corners before I pressed the shutter, once for my own records, once for a fireproof drive I kept at my sister's house an hour away, a habit built from 30 years of watching companies rewrite their own history a memo at a time. I wasn't warning anyone. I wasn't threatening anyone. I was simply making sure a fact that already existed couldn't later be argued into not existing. Owen's rewrite ticket referenced neither the binder nor my name anywhere in its scope. I confirmed that myself, cross-referencing the ticket number against the compliance registry line by line at my kitchen table, tracing each clause with a pen I never once needed to press to paper, until I was certain the omission wasn't an oversight I'd merely missed. The schematic sat folded beside the binder the whole time, corners soft as cloth, the same one that had ridden in my jacket pocket for 2 decades. I didn't need to open it. I already knew, from memory alone, exactly which page of the binder the interlock's fault logic traced back to. 3 days after the change order landed, a message from Norvale's own quality office reached my old inbox by accident, forwarded from the client's audit coordinator, a preliminary document checklist for the September visit, Item 11 asking specifically for current functional safety engineer certification records for the affected control system. Somebody on the client side already knew exactly what to ask for. Nobody at Norvale Praxis had checked that list against what was actually still valid, and nobody would, until there was no longer any list left to check against at all. 5 weeks after the change order, Owen stood up at the quarterly all-hands and told the room the interlock rewrite had come in ahead of schedule. I wasn't in the room. Leon was, and he called me that evening from his car in the parking structure, engine still running. He put a slide up, Leon said. Before and after line count. Called the whole original module ghost code, finally exorcised. Got a small laugh for that one. Tapped that keyboard of his on the podium like a gavel. How'd the room take it? Nobody clapped particularly hard. A couple of people looked at their phones. Has anyone flagged the revalidation gap to him directly? I flagged it in writing the day the ticket dropped. Got a thumbs up emoji and nothing else. I don't think anyone read past the subject line. You kept the email. I keep everything now. You taught half this building that habit, whether they credit you for it or not. A new engineer on the rewrite team had already introduced one small mistake by then, the kind nobody outside the floor would ever hear about. A rounding change in a threshold value that tripped a false pressure alarm on line 6 for 11 minutes before someone reset it and moved on, filed as a nuisance fault instead of what it actually was. Proof nobody currently touching that code fully understood what every line was protecting against. Did Owen see the line 6 alarm? I asked. Saw it, called it expected noise during a migration, and told the team not to over-index on transition artifacts. That's one way to describe it. His words, not mine. I asked the junior who made the threshold change whether he'd cross-checked it against the original fault logic. He said he didn't know there was an original to check against. Did anyone tell him there was? Not that I've heard. As far as that kid's concerned, he's writing the fault logic from scratch. That's a dangerous thing for a 24-year-old to believe about a safety system. I said as much. Owen said we needed people who moved fast, not people who moved carefully. I didn't call anyone that week. I didn't send a memo, didn't request a meeting, didn't do a single thing beyond noting the date in my own record next to everything else. That wasn't indifference. It was simply the only posture available to a man with no remaining standing over a floor he used to be trusted with. One more thing, Leon said. The client's quality lead called our office directly this afternoon. Said their team wants live system logs for the safety interlock pulled during the walkthrough, not just paperwork. Said it like it was routine. Is it routine? For a normal audit, sure. For this one, it means somebody on their side is planning to actually watch the thing operate in real time, not just read a binder about it. Owen's rewrite ticket closed out as complete 2 days later, the same week. No revalidation request filed anywhere in the record I could find. I checked twice, the way I checked everything, half expecting to have simply missed it, the ticket's closing timestamp sitting there in plain black text, unremarkable to anyone who didn't already know exactly what it was missing. That closed ticket, 3 lines long and unremarkable to anyone skimming the sprint board, was the one record in the entire building somebody genuinely should have sat down and read before calling anything finished. At 11:47 that Thursday night, according to the deployment log Tarun read me later, the rewrite went fully live, and the interlock's safety signature invalidated 9 minutes after that, silently, the way a rule triggers when nobody's watching for it. Line 6 locked into safe state first, at 3:14 in the morning. By 5:50, every downstream line sharing that certified logic had followed it into the same locked condition, one after another, the cascade moving exactly as fast as the shared dependency chain allowed and not 1 second faster. Each lockout logged automatically, with a timestamp nobody on shift that night was awake to read. First shift badge scanned in at 6 o'clock to doors that wouldn't clear. By 6:40, the floor supervisor had escalated to Tarun. By 7:15, Tarun had escalated to Owen, who according to 3 separate accounts spent the first 20 minutes insisting it had to be a badge reader malfunction rather than anything touching his rewrite. While all of that unfolded, I watered the citrus trees out back the way I did most mornings, hose in one hand, phone in the other, still in yesterday's shirt, not yet dressed for a day nobody had told me was happening. Tarun called at 7:52. Derek, I need you to tell me this is fixable. That depends what you mean by fixable and by whom. Every line downstream of the core interlock is in safe state. Nothing's processing. We can't even pull diagnostic logs without tripping another lockout. Did anyone check whether the safety signature is still valid? Why would the signature matter for a lockout? Ask whoever owns vendor compliance to pull the certification status specifically. Tell them to check revalidation records, not just uptime. A second call cut in 20 minutes later. Owen's assistant, someone I'd spoken to maybe twice in 2 months, her voice pitched carefully somewhere between formal and desperate. Mr. Ross, is there any chance you could log in remotely and take a look? I don't have write access to that module anymore. It was reassigned off my signature in September. Would that actually explain a full lockout? You need to ask the vendor. I'm not authorized to interpret their certification logic for you. Tarun called back at 9:15, his voice noticeably flatter than the first call. Finance is asking what the exposure looks like if this doesn't clear today. What did you tell them? $3.185 billion tied to this line's annual output, and we're already 6 hours into a 78-hour disclosure window on the client contract. Divide it out, and that's something like $40 million an hour sitting dark before anyone even gets to the audit itself. Did they ask where that number came from? Nobody had time to ask. They just wanted it to not be true. Has anyone told the client anything yet? Legal's drafting something now. Nobody wants to be the one who signs it. I didn't call anyone unprompted that morning. I didn't mention the binder, didn't reference the certification, didn't send a single email nobody had asked for. I only answered what I was directly asked, using facts that had already been true since a Tuesday 8 weeks earlier. Sitting quietly in a compliance binder nobody had thought to open until it was already too late to matter which shelf it was on. Around 11 that morning, the internal calls finally slowed to a trickle. That was, as it turned out, exactly when the calls from outside the building started instead. Same glass-walled conference room where Owen had first slid a change order across that table, 8 weeks earlier almost to the day. The emergency meeting they called for 1 o'clock that afternoon. The air still carrying the faint burnt plastic smell of an overworked HVAC unit nobody had gotten around to servicing. Tarun joined in person, the certification binder open in front of him. Leon sat near the door with a printed timeline, unopened on his lap. Owen opened before anyone else could. I want to be clear, this isn't a code failure, he said. Every diagnostic we've run shows the logic itself is sound. I still believe undocumented means unnecessary, for the record. This is a certification technicality, nothing more. It's not a technicality, Tarun said. It's clause 14 of the vendor agreement, and I've had legal confirm it independently in the last hour. Modification without revalidation invalidates the signature automatically. There's no discretion built into that language. With respect, that clause predates the current org structure. Predating something doesn't unwrite it, Tarun said. Derek's compensated status and his signatory authority were never formally transferred. He remains the designated functional safety engineer of record. Our own engineers reviewed the logic thoroughly before the rewrite shipped. Reviewing code isn't the same as being the certified signatory the vendor's insurer actually recognizes, Tarun said. You saved $3.32 million canceling his retainer. The exposure sitting on this line right now is nearly 1,000 times that, and climbing by the hour. I'd like independent legal confirmation of that clause before we proceed any further. You have it. Legal confirmed it 40 minutes ago, in writing, and I'm copying you on it now. Owen reached for his laptop, The ship fast, keycap set catching the fluorescent light, then didn't open it. His hand stayed flat on the closed lid for several seconds, knuckles pale against the aluminum, and he didn't say anything further for the first time since the meeting started. Somewhere down the hallway a cart will squeaked past the door, ordinary and indifferent to what was happening in this particular room. There's one more piece, Tarun said. Restoring the signature doesn't happen automatically. Recertification requires the original designated engineer's sign-off, in person, on updated documentation, cross-checked against the vendor's own registry before it's accepted. That's Derek. Nobody else at this table can file it, and nobody else at this table has for the last decade. So he's required to do it. He's the only one authorized to. Those aren't the same word, and today the difference is the entire point. I hadn't said anything at all since sitting down. I confirmed what I was asked to confirm, once. The documentation package is ready whenever the terms are. What would it take? Owen asked, finally, to the room rather than to me specifically. Tarun answered before I could. Full reinstatement of Derek's certification retainer and signatory authority, retroactive to the date it was canceled. A written commitment, board approved, that no safety instrumented logic gets modified without his sign-off going forward, and that the change control process itself gets reviewed before anyone touches it again. And the junior engineer who made the threshold change keeps his job. He followed the process he was given. He wasn't the one who skipped it. That's a significant set of terms. It's the set the contract already required, Tarun said. We didn't write it this morning. Owen looked at the binder, then at his own closed laptop, and didn't argue. Draft it, he said, quieter than anything he'd said all afternoon. Today, nothing in that room had actually malfunctioned. A clause had simply enforced itself, exactly as written. 8 months after that meeting, the vendor's annual functional safety conference invited me to present the Norvale incident as an anonymized case study. No company name attached, just the mechanism and the lesson. I accepted the honorarium tied to it, $2,090,000, paid out under the same consulting and licensing schedule I'd negotiated back when the certification retainer was first restored, the exact figure the schedule specified and never once renegotiated upward. Nobody handed it to me as a gift. I'd simply kept doing the work the schedule already described, and let the schedule do the rest. Owen stayed on at Norvale Praxis through the transition, reassigned to a platform integrations role, with no signatory authority over anything safety-related and no seat on the change control board that had once rubber-stamped his rewrite in an afternoon. His name came off the interlock modules roster within the week. I checked the registry myself out of habit, more than curiosity, and found it blank where his had briefly been, the field simply empty rather than reassigned to anyone new. The ship fast keycap set, I heard, didn't survive the move to his smaller office. I heard, secondhand, that he'd taken the reassignment better than most people in his position would have. I hope that's true. I don't have a strong need for it not to be, and I've never once brought any of it up with him directly since. Leon moved into a newly created compliance liaison role, the exact function his warnings had been trying to fill for months before anyone above him listened. He still calls occasionally, mostly to confirm whether any other module on the floor has a similar gap sitting quietly in its documentation. So far, checked twice over, none has, though he tells me the checking itself has become routine enough now that nobody upstairs blinks at the request anymore. My wife finished her final round of treatment that spring, the balance on the account I'd never said aloud in that building finally closing out to zero in a single transfer instead of month after month of smaller ones arriving quietly every quarter. I didn't explain the settlement to her in detail. The specifics of a compliance clause weren't a conversation she needed to sit through. I told her only that the money had come through, and she asked if I'd remembered to water the citrus trees while she was at her appointment. I had. She said that was good, and asked what we were having for dinner, and I told her, and that was the whole conversation. I still carry the same schematic, corners softer now than they were even a year ago, one new fold added where I'd tucked in a printed copy of the vendor's revised change control checklist behind it. I've had 2 chances to retire the habit of carrying it at all. I've kept it anyway. It isn't sentiment. It's simply still the fastest way I know to find the exact line something depends on. Work on the floor is different in small ways nobody outside it would ever notice or think to write up as a case study. Change tickets touching safety logic get a second signature now, unprompted, before anyone even asks for one. Nobody has called any part of that module a liability since, not once, not even in passing. It wasn't payback. It was a signature that had never stopped meaning what it was written to mean, doing, eventually, the one job it was always there to do.